with her pregnancy already beginning to show and drowning in the debt she'd taken on to pay for her late mother's cancer treatment. 27-year-old nurse Delaney Brooks had learned to keep her head down at St. Ambrose Medical Center in Chicago, because the senior staff had already decided what she was, a broke, unmarried girl in worn-out shoes who'd gotten herself into trouble and didn't belong in their emergency room. So when a wounded man was rushed in that afternoon, bleeding through his field dressing and throwing off every pair of hands that touched him, the charge nurse didn't assign him to Delaney out of trust. She did it as a joke. What she didn't tell Delaney was that the patient couldn't hear a single word anyone said, that he was Dario Baroni, 37 years old, the most feared Mafia boss in Chicago, a man whose own doctors had just declared his deafness permanent, hopeless, beyond saving, and whose empire's enemies had left him half dead on a stretcher, with 2 bodyguards blocking the trauma bay doors. The veteran nurses gathered outside the glass, arms folded, quietly betting on how many minutes the pregnant girl would last before she broke down or got hurt, and one of them actually laughed out loud when Delaney picked up a whiteboard on her way in. But Delaney didn't shout. She didn't call security. She didn't reach for the restraints or the sedative everyone was screaming for. She stepped into the wounded man's line of sight, raised that whiteboard, and wrote 3 simple lines that stopped the most dangerous man in the city cold. And here's the part nobody standing at that window could explain. Dario Baroni froze before he'd even finished reading the words, because it wasn't the message that hit him first, it was the handwriting. 60 minutes later, the man they'd all written off as a lost cause signed his own surgical consent with a steady hand, no sedation, no restraints, and the laughing outside that glass had gone completely silent. But that hour was only the beginning, because days later, in a conference room where the hospital was preparing to fire Delaney and bury the truth, that same Mafia boss walked in against his doctor's orders, set the unwiped whiteboard on the table, pulled a worn napkin from his wallet, and pointed straight at her in front of every executive in the room. What was written on that napkin, and what it revealed about the child she was carrying, left the entire hospital in stunned silence, because it was a secret even Delaney herself didn't know yet. She'd saved his life twice, and only one of those times had she known his real name. If you've ever been looked down on for your circumstances, ever been told that being poor, or pregnant, or too kind somehow made you less, then stay with this one, because this story is for you. Before we begin, do us a small favor, hit that like button, share this story with someone who needs to hear it today, and subscribe to the channel so you never miss what's coming next. Your support genuinely keeps stories like this alive, and it costs you nothing but a second. Now, let's go back to that gray Chicago afternoon, back to the moment the trauma bay doors slammed open, and a pregnant nurse everyone had underestimated picked up a whiteboard and walked toward the man no one else could save, the emergency department at St. Ambrose Medical Center, to a rhythm outsiders could never understand, fast, loud, and efficient to the point of cruelty. Stretchers rolled through the corridors, like train cars that were never late. Orders were shouted in a compressed language only those in the profession could decipher, and anyone who hesitated for even half a second was thrown from the machinery like a piece of debris. At the center of that machinery stood Diane Kessler, 54 years old, head nurse for 15 years, a woman who had never needed to raise her voice to make the entire department fall silent. She wasn't cruel in the way people usually imagined cruelty. She was simply efficient, and over the years that efficiency had calcified into a layer of hard stone, until she could no longer tell the difference between an unnecessary step that ought to be cut away and a necessary one that allowed a human being to remain human. To Diane, anything slower than procedure was a failure in the system, and in her eyes, Delaney Brooks was a walking system failure. That morning, before everything happened, Delaney knelt on one knee beside bed 7, bringing herself level with the eyes of an 80-year-old man who was trembling with fear of the needle, and she did what she always did. She took the marker from the breast pocket of her uniform, the one she carried the way other people carried a talisman, drew a simple vein on a piece of paper, and explained what she was about to do. It took exactly 30 seconds. The old man breathed out, his fingers loosened their grip on the bed rail, and the needle entered the vein on the first attempt. Her mother had taught her that, not from any textbook, but during the years when Ruth Brooks still stood behind the nurse's station at a small hospital. 30 seconds of explanation, she used to say, would always cost less than 30 minutes spent managing a complication. Fear made the heart race, sent blood pressure soaring, and tightened muscles around wounds that needed to remain still. Tenderness, therefore, wasn't courtesy. It was medicine. Delaney believed that down to the marrow of her bones. But just as she was securing the dressing, Diane's voice came from behind her, loud enough for 3 nearby nurses to hear. This wasn't a nursing home, she said. They needed people who could do the work, not people who needed sympathy, and if Delaney wanted to hold patients' hands all day, then perhaps she had chosen the wrong profession. Delaney didn't answer. She finished pressing down the dressing, folded the paper with the drawing of the vein, placed it in the old man's palm like a promise, then rose and moved on. But words like those didn't dissolve into the air. They settled, they seeped downward. They became a kind of unspoken permission for the entire department. In the staff lounge, someone had taped a small calendar to the refrigerator, and on it were names beside numbers, a quiet betting game over how many more weeks the pregnant girl would last before writing her own resignation letter. Delaney knew the calendar was there. She opened that refrigerator every day to take out the lunch she had brought from home, and not once had she torn it down, because tearing it down would mean letting them see that it could reach her. At the end of her shift, while the others changed clothes and went home, she sat in the corner of the locker room, pulled a bottle of shoe glue from her backpack, and pressed the gaping sole of her left shoe firmly back into place. She held it there for a full 60 seconds while the glue dried, because a new pair of shoes would mean cutting money from her next prenatal appointment. She made that calculation every day, calculations that never produced a beautiful answer. The bank sent letters faithfully every month, each one carrying the figures of the $63,000 loan she had signed with her own hand and charged to her own cards during the 2 years her mother fought cancer, the chemotherapy bills, the emergency room nights, the medications the insurance company refused to cover. People told her she had been foolish, that she had no legal obligation to carry that burden, that she should have let the hospital chase whomever it wished. But that was her mother, the woman who had taught her every decent thing she knew, and Delaney had never regretted a single one of those signatures, not even now, when each month's paycheck was torn into 3 pieces. One went to the bank, one went to the tiny studio apartment beside the elevated train tracks, where the windows shuttered every 10 minutes. The thinnest piece went toward everything else, including the small life growing steadily inside her. That was why, on some nights, after spending 12 hours on her feet in the emergency department, she tied on an apron at a late-night diner that stayed open until 3 o'clock in the morning, carrying coffee to truck drivers and people who couldn't sleep, her feet swollen inside shoes held together with glue, one hand occasionally resting on her belly, as though to tell her child that mommy was all right, that mommy was still standing. She told no one at the hospital about that second job, just as she told no one about the debt, the betting calendar, or the place beneath her breastbone where Diane's words kept cutting. She simply came to work, always on time, her uniform neatly pressed, the marker always tucked into her breast pocket, and did her job exactly the way her mother had taught her. What no one in the St. Ambrose emergency department had ever bothered to notice was that her tenderness had never been a weakness. It was a method, and in only a few more hours, inside the loudest room in the hospital, that method was about to be tested by fire in a way no one, not even Delaney herself, could possibly have imagined. 12 miles to the south, where the cranes of Chicago Harbor stood against the gray sky like steel skeletons, there was a room paneled in dark walnut on the top floor of a logistics building, and inside that room, the world moved according to an entirely different set of laws. People called it the Barone family office, though no sign anywhere bore that name. The empire stretched from container-loading docks to transportation companies whose names appeared on official documents and other companies whose names appeared nowhere at all, a network woven across 3 generations, and for the past 11 years, every thread in that network had led back to a single hand, the hand of Dario Barone. At 37, he ran everything the way his father had taught him, with few words, never making the same threat twice, and with enough ruthlessness that no one wished to discover what a second threat might look like. The men who sat across from him at that wooden desk often said the most frightening thing about Dario wasn't what he did, but the silence that came before he did it. They didn't know that for the past 6 months, that silence had no longer been his choice. It was all he had left. That afternoon had begun like every other afternoon, with the two brothers walking into the parking lot after a meeting at Pier 9, Gino a few steps ahead, turning back as he walked to finish some half-told joke, 33 years old and still laughing like the boy who used to skip school and follow his older brother down to the harbor. Then the world folded in half. Dario had no memory of the explosion itself, only the ground tipping sideways, the force of the blast striking like a giant hand, and when he opened his eyes through the smoke and dust, he found himself crawling toward his brother. He saw Gino's lips moving again and again with desperate urgency, as though he were trying to tell him the most important thing he had ever said, and Dario couldn't hear a single sound. No car horns, no screams, not even the beating of his own heart. There was only a blinding white silence and his brother's lips moving more slowly, then more slowly still, until they stopped altogether. They buried Gino on a rainy day. Dario stood beside the grave and watched the priest's mouth open and close without hearing a single word of the prayer, and he understood that some things had been lowered into the earth with his brother that no music, no bells, and no solemn procession could ever properly mourn. The police placed the blame on the Quinn gang across the river, calling it the settlement of an old territorial debt, and the investigation slowly went cold, as investigations involving the Barone name always did. Dario's ears were entrusted to Dr. Hargrove, the silver-haired audiology specialist the family had relied on for years, a soft-spoken man who, after 3 rounds of testing inside a soundproof room, placed a file in front of him containing a conclusion printed in the cold language of medicine: profound bilateral sensorineural hearing loss, permanent, no intervention indicated, no possibility of recovery, hopeless, in simpler terms. Dario read the report once, folded it closed, and never mentioned it again. But someone else mentioned it for him: Carlo Baroni, 42 years old, Dario's cousin and the only other man left carrying that name after Gino's death, became attentive in a way he had never been before. Carlo came every day, bringing reports, bringing coffee, even teaching himself to write in large, clear letters on notepaper. And it was that very thoughtfulness that kept anyone from noticing one small detail. In every meeting, Carlo always chose to stand or sit on Dario's left side, beside the ear that had suffered the greater damage, the side where not even the faintest vibration could reach him. From that position, he could say things to the entire room that the head of the family would never know he had missed. It was Carlo, too, speaking with the concerned devotion of a loyal relative, who began planting a question in his private conversations with members of the family council, wrapping it in the soft velvet of worry. Could a man who couldn't hear a telephone ring, couldn't hear a warning, couldn't even hear the sound of a gun being cocked behind him, still be capable of steering an empire that was being hunted from every direction? The question spread like oil across dark water. What Carlo hadn't accounted for was that the man behind the walnut desk had never stopped watching. After losing sound, Dario learned to read the world with his eyes. He hired a deaf instructor to come to his apartment late at night and quietly practiced reading lips for 6 months. And now, during meetings in which people believed he was trapped inside silence, he understood far more than anyone dared say directly to his face. He saw voices lowered when his name was spoken. He watched the word competence take shape on the lips of men who had once bowed their heads before his father. He recorded everything and showed no reaction, like a card player keeping his face still after realizing someone at the table had marked the deck. And very late at night, when the logistics building held nothing but the hum of generators he couldn't hear, Dario sat alone in the dark wood-paneled room and took from his wallet a paper napkin worn soft at all 4 corners, carefully flattened and folded like a classified document. He didn't open it. He only held it between 2 fingers for a long while, the way a person touches an old scar to make certain he is still alive, then returned it to the innermost compartment, where he had kept it for the past 4.5 months, closer to his heart than anything else that man still allowed himself to hold on to. That afternoon, the Barone family's 2-vehicle convoy left the harbor, along a route it had traveled hundreds of times before, and at an intersection trapped between 2 rows of warehouses, a delivery truck stalled across the road, in a manner the police would later describe as anything but accidental. The residents nearby heard what happened during the next 40 seconds, but they didn't see it, and when everything fell silent again, the lead vehicle was riddled with bullet holes along its left side. The windshield had shattered into a white spiderweb, and Mickey Doran, 45 years old, the bodyguard who had taken bullets for 2 generations of the Barone family, was using his entire body to press down on the wound in his employer's chest, shouting words into his radio that the man beneath him couldn't hear. Dario remained conscious throughout the ambulance ride. A bullet fragment lodged somewhere between his left shoulder and chest, blood soaking through the improvised, pressure dressing faster than the paramedics could replace it, and inside the absolute silence that had become his prison, he watched the white ceiling of the ambulance tremble over every pothole, watched the hands of strangers hovering above his chest, and began making the calculation that anyone in his line of work had to make. Whoever was skilled enough to know that route was also skilled enough to know where this ambulance was going. The nearest hospital from that intersection was St. Ambrose Medical Center, 11 minutes away if every red light was ignored, and dispatch had already alerted the emergency department with a transfer report that any head nurse should have read carefully. Male, 37 years old, penetrating wound to the left shoulder and chest, hemodynamically unstable, followed by 3 boxed warning lines. The patient had complete hearing loss in both ears. He had a history of acute trauma responses when physically restrained. An alternative method of communication was strongly recommended before contact. Diane Kessler stood at the nurse's station and read the report from beginning to end, with the eyes of a woman who had read tens of thousands like it over the course of 15 years, and those watching her saw her pause over the 3 boxed lines for a fraction longer than usual. Then she folded the page in half, pushed it beneath the stack of files on the counter, lifted her head, swept her gaze across the department as though choosing a piece on a chessboard, and called out a single name. Delaney was changing the sheets in room 5 when Diane's voice cut across the entire corridor, announcing that a critical transfer was on the way, one that, according to her, was exactly Delaney's kind of case, an uncooperative patient. Delaney was always claiming she was good at connecting with people, Diane said, so in 15 minutes she could go out there and connect. A few quiet laughs drifted from the nurse's station. Delaney set down the pillow. She could hear the trap in Diane's words, but she couldn't yet see its shape, and she did the only thing a nurse could do when she had been assigned a patient without being given any information. She went looking for it. The intake file had only just been created in the system and was nearly empty. The abbreviated name D. Barone meant nothing to her except that the surname sounded Italian. 37 years old. Penetrating wound. Blood pressure falling with every update from the ambulance. But Delaney didn't stop at the first page. Her mother had taught her that the most important information about a patient was often buried in the place no one bothered to read, so she scrolled all the way down to the attached assessment notes, the hurried lines entered by dispatch, and there, hidden among the clinical measurements, she found the words that made her straighten. Complete hearing loss, history of trauma response when restrained, alternative communication recommended. She read those 3 lines twice. Then she looked at the clock. 12 minutes remained, and inside her mind, everything arranged itself into a list in the same way her mother had always arranged things. A man who couldn't hear was about to be taken into the loudest room in the hospital, where everyone gave orders with their voices. A man who would panic if pinned down was about to be surrounded by 8 unfamiliar hands, and not one person working that shift had been told either of those things. She went straight to the supply cart, took the large whiteboard normally used for staff assignments, wiped it clean, and tested 2 markers in one corner to make sure the ink was still dark. Then she tucked a 3rd marker into the breast pocket of her uniform, beside the one she always carried. 8 minutes remained. She searched the document cabinet and found the picture communication card the department had been issued so many years ago that no one could remember when. Its simple symbols representing pain, thirst, consent, and refusal. She studied them once and committed them to memory. 5 minutes remained. In one corner of the whiteboard, she drew a simple human figure, circled the left shoulder, added an arrow and a question mark, then wrote a single word across the very top, her name. 2 minutes remained when the ambulance siren began to rise in the distance, growing louder and louder, and when the receiving bay doors burst open, the first things through them weren't the stretcher, but two men in dark suits stained with someone else's blood, their faces hard as cold steel. They immediately took positions on either side of the emergency room doorway, as though those were the places they had been born to stand. While out in the lobby, two patrol officers had somehow already arrived, radios crackling on their shoulders. The entire St. Ambrose emergency department, a place that never stopped moving, slowed for half a heartbeat like a machine encountering something foreign. In the center of that momentary stillness, a 27-year-old nurse walked toward the receiving bay, holding a whiteboard against her chest, and the clock on the wall read exactly 2:07 in the afternoon. The stretcher burst through the double doors with the speed of a patient bleeding out, and the world Dario Barone saw from where he lay flat on his back didn't look like a hospital. Blinding white light ceiling lights slid above him like headlights. Masked faces leaned down from every direction. Gloved hands reached toward his chest, where the wound throbbed in time with his heartbeat, and everything unfolded in absolute silence. There was no sound of wheels, no shouted commands, not even the hum of machinery, only mouths opening and closing behind masks he couldn't read, arms pointing, and hurried shadows moving at the edges of his vision. To an ordinary person, it was an emergency room. To a man who had been sprayed with bullets less than an hour earlier, and who, 6 months before that, had crawled through smoke and rubble while watching his younger brother die in silence. It was the ambush continuing. Dario's mind could no longer tell the difference, and the part of him that remained rational, the part that still thought according to the logic of the Underworld, whispered a chilling truth. Anyone capable of stopping his convoy in broad daylight was more than capable of planting someone in a white coat inside this room to finish the job, and he was lying flat, motionless, surrounded by 8 strangers' hands, in the most vulnerable position of his life. Then a nurse touched his left arm to secure the intravenous line, and Dario's body made the decision before his mind could. He ripped the tube from his vein, blood and fluid spraying across the white sheet, then swung his good arm sideways and sent the nurse staggering into the supply cart. A metal tray crashed to the floor in a violent clatter. Everyone in the room heard except him. He braced himself on one elbow, clenched his teeth, and with the same force of will that had carried him to the top of an empire, managed to plant one foot on the floor and force himself upright while blood spread farther across the already soaked dressing over his left shoulder. The room erupted like a hive struck with a stick. 2 staff members rushed forward to force him back down, but one shove from the man, who stood more than 6 feet 3 inches tall, sent them both stumbling aside. The attending physician shouted over his shoulder toward the medication station for sedation and restraints. And beneath the overlapping voices, a quieter one rose from the doorway, sharp as a cold blade, telling them to wait, that his blood pressure was falling and pinning him down to inject him, now meant gambling with his life. No one listened. Delaney Brooks stood at the entrance to the trauma bay, with the whiteboard held against her chest, and in 2 seconds she saw the whole truth no one else in the room could see. A deaf man was surrounded by people who only knew how to give orders with their voices. A man who would die if he kept fighting and might also die if they forced him down. Everything he was doing, everything the room called resistance, had only one true name: fear. She drew in a breath and spoke in a voice she had never used at St. Ambrose. Not loud, but so level that it cut through every other sound. Everyone stepped back. Several hands froze. She said it again, one word at a time. Everyone. Step back. This time the absolute stillness in her voice. A stillness that didn't belong to a young nurse, that made the attending physician turn his head, made the reaching hands withdraw, and opened a gap in the circle, around the stretcher. Delaney stepped through it. She didn't come any closer. She stopped exactly 4 paces from the man who was struggling for breath, rested the whiteboard against her hip, and raised both hands to chest level with her palms open toward him. Empty hands. Then she stood still. She didn't move another inch. She didn't speak again, because she knew words were useless now. She only stood there, her eyes searching for his, waiting, while behind her the entire room held its breath and beyond the observation glass. Diane Kessler stood with her arms folded, motionless as a statue with no intention of intervening. Dario saw her through the haze of pain and blood loss, a small woman in hospital scrubs with both hands raised, holding no needle, no restraint, nothing at all, standing far enough away not to be a threat and close enough for him to see clearly. and that posture, in the only language his body still trusted, said something very simple. I'm not attacking you. In that room, where every body was still drawn tight, she was the only still point, and it was that stillness, not any command, that made the cornered man's gaze cling to her as though she were a piece of solid ground in the middle of a storm. She waited until she was certain his eyes had anchored themselves to hers, then slowly lifted the whiteboard, uncapped the marker, and wrote in large, rounded letters that leaned slightly to the right. You're in a hospital. You're safe. I won't touch you without warning you first. She turned the board toward him. Then it happened, the thing the people behind the glass would talk about for years, without ever being able to explain it. The man, who was still wound tight as a cable about to snap, stopped before he had even finished reading the first line. Not after he reached the end, halfway through the first line. His eyes fixed on the words, not following the meaning of the sentence, but freezing on the shape of the handwriting itself, on the full loops of the letters, on their familiar, breath-stealing slant, and everyone in the room watched as his right hand, the hand that had remained clenched into a fist from the moment the stretcher crossed the doors, slowly opened, one finger at a time. The monitor beside him recorded his heart rate beginning to fall, and inside the loudest room at St. Ambrose Medical Center, a deaf man and a nurse the entire department had dismissed were staring at one another across 3 handwritten lines, at the exact beginning of an hour that would make every person watching regret that they had laughed. The man was still standing there with the blood-soaked dressing over his shoulder. But something in his posture had changed. His weight had shifted back toward the stretcher behind him instead of driving forward, and Delaney read that change the way she read a vital sign. She wiped the board clean with the side of her hand and wrote slowly and clearly, My name is Delaney. You're losing blood. You need to sit down. I won't let anyone touch you without your consent. She raised the board. He read it, his gaze moving from the words to her face and then back to the words. And after a moment that stretched like an entire negotiation, he took half a step backward and lowered himself onto the edge of the stretcher, his hand finally releasing the metal rail he had been gripping as though it were the side of a boat. Someone behind her let out a breath. From that moment on, Delaney began doing something no procedure at St. Ambrose had ever taught. She turned herself into an interpreter between a room filled with sound and a man who no longer had any sound at all. She turned the whiteboard toward the team and then back toward him, moving with the steady rhythm of a shuttle. She wrote, Blood pressure on your right arm, now, then held the board up for him to read, waited for his nod, and only then signaled the nurse to approach from the side he could see. She wrote, The doctor needs to examine your wound. He'll touch your shoulder in 3 seconds, and she counted on her fingers 1, 2, 3, so he would know the exact moment a stranger's hand would meet his skin. Every needle, every cut through the bandage, every tube, all of it passed through the whiteboard before entering his body, and the man who had knocked 2 medical workers aside now sat as still as stone, moving only the part of himself he had been warned about, his eyes never leaving the board, the way a drowning man never lets go of a rope. The examination took longer than usual. Everyone could see that, but no one dared say it now, because the numbers on the monitor were speaking for them. His heart rate steadily returned toward a safe range, his blood pressure stopped falling, and a patient who only minutes earlier had required 4 people to restrain him was now extending his uninjured arm on his own so a nurse could draw blood. In the corner, the medication nurse still stood holding the sedative syringe that had been prepared under the earlier order, looking toward the attending physician and waiting for a nod. After several seconds of studying the monitor, and then the man calmly enduring each procedure, the physician gave a slight shake of his head. The medication was placed back on the tray, intact and unopened, the plastic cap unbroken, then returned to the medication station with the routine note entered in the log, prepared as ordered, not administered. No one in that room knew then that before long, that unopened dose, and the small line recording its fate, would carry more weight than every spoken statement in a conference room. When the imaging results came back, the attending physician confirmed what everyone had already suspected. The bullet fragment had to be removed in surgery, and it had to happen as soon as possible. Out of habit, he began speaking loudly and slowly toward the patient, as though volume might somehow penetrate silence, and Delaney quietly stepped between them, wiped the board clean, and wrote 4 short sentences. You need surgery to remove the bullet fragment. The anesthesiologist will put you to sleep. When you wake up, it will be over. I'll leave a message for you beside the bed." She drew the simple human figure again, circled the left shoulder, marked the location of the fragment, then added one final line, the line the entire department would later repeat, as though it had been something impossible. "Do you agree to sign the surgical consent form? You have the right to refuse." The attending physician stared at those words, as though they were a luxury that didn't belong in an emergency room. But the man on the stretcher read them for a long time, longer than he had read anything before, as though no one in the past 6 months had ever reminded him that he still had authority over his own body. Then he held out his uninjured hand. Delaney placed the paperwork and the pen in it, and before the eyes of the entire team, the man who had lost nearly 1/4 of his blood signed his name with strokes so steady that no one could believe them. The signature was sharp, clean, and unshaken, placed on the page exactly 1 hour after his stretcher had burst through the emergency department doors. The stretcher rolled toward the surgical elevators, and Delaney walked on his left side, where he could see her, the whiteboard held against her chest, until the steel doors closed between them. She remained there for one more heartbeat, then turned back toward the department and realized the entire staff was looking at her the way people look at something that has just changed shape. No one said a word. That was the strangest part of all. The people who had laughed the loudest now kept their faces lowered toward their computer screens. Someone wandered off to change bed sheets that didn't need changing. In the staff lounge, the bedding calendar on the refrigerator door had disappeared without anyone seeing when it was taken down, leaving only 4 faded pieces of tape at the corners. The traces of a joke no one wished to admit had belonged to them. Regret at St. Ambrose didn't take the form of an apology. It took the form of silence and eyes that turned away. In the intake area, the employee responsible for cataloging patient belongings followed the usual procedure with the items removed from the torn suit, a phone with a shattered screen, a watch, and a black leather wallet. The employee opened the wallet, counted the money for the inventory record, and brushed a finger across the edge of a thin sheet of paper folded flat in the innermost compartment. The hand paused for half a second because the paper seemed out of place, then moved on, closed the wallet, and sealed everything inside a numbered property bag. Delaney, meanwhile, sat at the nurse's station during her brief break and cut a piece of stiff paper into a small card. In the same rounded handwriting that leaned slightly to the right, she wrote in advance the words she believed a man like him would need more than pain medication when he opened his eyes in another unfamiliar room. "Dario, you survived. You're in the hospital. I'm standing beside you." His medical history had taught her something. Some people didn't wake into the present. They woke inside the oldest disaster of their lives, and when that happened, the thing capable of bringing them back wasn't a voice calling their name, but a line of words placed in exactly the right spot, already waiting, to understand why 3 handwritten lines on a whiteboard could stop the most dangerous man in Chicago before he had even finished reading half of the first one. The story had to return to a night months earlier, before the winter chill had even begun to break, a night when the entire city seemed to have been drowned beneath a February thunderstorm that showed no sign of ending. The late-night diner where Delaney worked her second shift was tucked beneath the elevated train tracks, a warm box of golden light in a curtain of driving rain, and at around 1 o'clock in the morning, when only 2 truck drivers remained inside, nodding over cups of cold coffee, the glass door flew open with a coil of wet wind, and a man stepped inside as though the storm had just cast him out. His coat was soaked and clinging to his shoulders. His hair lay wet across his forehead. He had no umbrella and no hat, and his eyes held the emptiness of someone who had been walking for a very long time without trying to reach anywhere at all. He sat at the table in the farthest corner with his back to the wall, and when Delaney brought him a menu and asked what he would like, he only looked up, pointed one finger toward his ear, slowly shook his head, then lowered his gaze to the tabletop as though a door had quietly closed itself. Another waitress might have nodded awkwardly and pointed to the picture of the eggs. Delaney stood there for a second, then did what she had done all her life, without knowing that tonight it would change everything. She took the paper liner from the nearest tray, turned it over to the blank side, pulled the pen from her apron pocket, and wrote in rounded letters that leaned slightly to the right. "Then let's talk this way. What would you like to drink? The coffee here is terrible, but it's hot." She slid the paper across the table. The man stared at the words for so long that she began to think she had done something wrong. Then he looked up, and something moved faintly in the empty eyes he had brought in with him, like an ember stirring beneath ash. He took the pen and wrote beneath her words in sharp, clean strokes that leaned to the left. "Coffee. Black. Thank you for not shouting in my face." She brought the coffee with a stack of paper napkins and a second pen, setting them down as though she were dealing a hand of cards. And that night, while rain struck the windows in a language only she could hear, two strangers told each other more than either of them had told anyone in years, using ink on paper napkins. He wrote that his name was Rio, nothing more. No last name. She didn't ask because there was something in the way he wrote it, the slight hesitation at the first stroke, that told her it was all he could give away that night. Through the napkins passing back and forth across the table, she told him about the mother she had lost 6 months earlier, about the chemotherapy bills she had signed without ever letting her mother know, about the debt that now arrived as her companion every month, and about the way people at work looked at her as though she were a deer that had wandered into a slaughterhouse simply because she knelt to meet a patient's eyes before inserting a needle. She wrote, "They say I'm too soft for this work." He read the line twice, then answered in his left-leaning handwriting with a sentence she would remember forever. "Where I work, tenderness is the first thing they shoot." She looked at those words, at the strange calluses on his hands, at the faint scar near his temple, and she didn't ask what kind of work he did, partly out of tact, and partly because inside a late-night diner beneath the train tracks and everyone had the right to be nothing more than a rain-soaked customer. Instead, she asked how long he had been unable to hear, and he wrote, 6 weeks, followed by 3 words that made her heart sink. "They say forever." Then he wrote again, more slowly this time, that the most frightening part wasn't the silence, but the way the people around him gradually stopped bothering to say anything to him at all, that after only 6 weeks, he had already begun to become invisible. Delaney set down her own cup of coffee, took a fresh napkin, and wrote the sentence that 4.5 months later would lie carefully folded inside the wallet of a man all Chicago feared. "Every storm eventually passes. You don't have to hear it to know that." He read it, and for the first time that night, he smiled, an awkward smile, as though the muscles of his face had forgotten how. Then he folded the napkin into quarters, as carefully as though he were folding a piece of silver, and slipped it into the breast pocket of his shirt, still damp with rain. The diner slowly emptied. The 2 truck drivers left. Her coworker dozed behind the counter, and the 2 of them kept writing to each other across the boundary of the plastic table, about small things and things that weren't small at all, until the rain thinned into mist and the diner sign cast its light across the puddles outside. Whatever happened during the rest of that night, after her shift ended at 3 o'clock, and dawn was still 3 hours away, belonged only to the 2 of them and the rain-washed city, a pocket of warmth that each would preserve in a different way, like a burning match protected inside a closed hand. All that was known was that when daylight came, Delaney woke to headlights sweeping across the window, 2 long beams from a black car that had pulled sharply to the curb below, and when she looked around, the man named Rio was gone. Only the last trace of his warmth remained, along with a paper napkin tucked beneath the cold coffee cup. On it, in his left-leaning handwriting, was an unfinished sentence that would never be completed. "If I were someone else." There was no goodbye, no telephone number, no last name. She stood at the window and watched the black car disappear through the misting rain, then picked up the unfinished napkin, folded it into quarters exactly as he had folded hers, and put it away. 4.5 months later, that napkin still rested inside an envelope in her studio apartment beside the train tracks, tucked among the first photographs of a tiny life. And the woman who kept it had no idea that across the city, the other napkin from that storm-filled night was being preserved in exactly the same way by someone else, close to his heart, and never opened in front of another person. Dario rose from unconsciousness like a man thrown ashore from the bottom of deep water. The ceiling was unfamiliar, the light was unfamiliar, and the silence was still the same old silence, that prison without walls, but his body didn't know where it was inside that silence. The anesthetic still lay like fog over his mind, and instinct did what it always did, placing everything it couldn't identify into the category of danger. His hand searched blindly for something that wasn't there. A railing, the grip of a gun, the edge of a wall, and when a recovery room nurse instinctively reached out to restrain his arm and protect the surgical wound, his entire powerful body sprang upward like a released coil. His uninjured arm swept sideways, the instrument tray beside the bed crashed to the floor, and hurried footsteps began converging on the room. But this time, before the room could become the third ambush of his life, a small hand placed a piece of stiff card directly within his line of sight and held it perfectly still. Through the haze of the anesthetic, rounded letters leaning slightly to the right appeared like dry land in the middle of a flood. "Dario, you survived. You're in the hospital. I'm standing beside you." He read it, then he read it again, and everyone in the recovery room witnessed something they would talk about for a very long time. The patient who had just knocked an entire tray of instruments to the floor slowly released the tension from every muscle, like a bow whose string had been removed, his eyes still fixed on the card, his chest rising and falling more slowly as the line on the monitor redrew itself into gentle rolling hills. Delaney waited until he had returned completely to the present, then wrote on the board that the surgery was over and had been successful. Afterward, she placed the orientation card on the table beside his bed, propping it against his water cup so it would always remain within sight, and that was where it stayed throughout the days that followed, like a lighthouse made of cardboard. Those days soon formed a pattern no one in the recovery ward had discussed, yet everyone came to understand. Each time the man in the room at the far end of the corridor woke, the first thing he did was search for one particular face. When that face wasn't there, he reached for the pad of paper on the table, wrote a name in sharp strokes leaning to the left, Delaney, and held it up to whoever entered the room, patient and unyielding, until someone went to find her. The name began appearing along the edges of medication instructions, in the corner of the hospital menu, and on the back of laboratory reports, as though his hand kept writing it while the man who owned that hand was thinking about something else. Then, on the afternoon of the second day after surgery, when he was alert enough to remember who he was and what belonged to him, Dario wrote on the board that he wanted his personal property returned. They brought him the numbered, sealed bag. He signed for it, waited until the employee had left the room, then opened his wallet with one hand and slowly removed the paper napkin folded into quarters, worn soft at all four corners. From its innermost compartment, he placed it on the bedside table, unfolded each crease with the care of a man dismantling a detonator, smoothed it flat, then took down the orientation card propped beside the water cup and placed the two pieces of paper next to each other beneath the bedside lamp. Every storm eventually passes. You don't have to hear it to know that. The ink had faded over 4.5 months, but the full, rounded loops of the letters were still there, leaning slightly to the right. Beside them, on the newer piece of stiff card, were the words "Dario, you survived," written with the same rounded loops, the same slant, the same hand. His thumb moved slowly along the edge of the napkin once, then twice, the gesture of a man checking whether the thing before him was real, and the monitor attached to his chest did the only honest thing in the room. His heart rhythm leaped into a row of sharp peaks, making the nurse at the station outside snap her head up toward the central screen. When Delaney was called in to examine him, she found him lying perfectly still, the card returned to its place beside the water cup, and the surface of the table completely bare. She wrote on the board and asked whether he was in pain. He shook his head, his expression as calm as frozen water, revealing nothing of what was moving beneath it. What was moving beneath it was a calculation. This man had lived by calculations his entire life, bullet trajectories, streams of money, the loyalties of men, and now the numbers arranged themselves inside his mind in a sequence he couldn't stop. The stormy night had been 4.5 months earlier, and the woman standing beside his bed with the whiteboard carried beneath her uniform a curve that had become unmistakable, a curve anyone with experience would recognize as roughly 4 months, perhaps more. His gaze dropped toward the edge of the blanket. He didn't allow his eyes to remain there for more than a second, because he knew she was watching him, but 1 second was enough for the calculation to reach its conclusion. For the first time in his life, Dario Baroni, a man whose hands had never trembled before the barrel of any gun, felt fear at the answer, not because he feared it was wrong, but because he feared it was right. because if it was right, then his world, crowded with enemies, had just gained 2 more hostages whose existence he could never allow anyone to discover. He wrote nothing about it, not one word. He folded the suspicion into quarters the way he folded the napkin, placed it in the deepest part of himself, and instead, later that afternoon, he wrote another question on the board and pushed it toward her. "Who treats you badly here?" Delaney read the question and paused for a heartbeat because he had addressed her with a tenderness more intimate than before, then wrote an evasive answer, saying there were all kinds of people everywhere, and that he should worry more about his surgical wound. He didn't ask again, but during the days he remained there, from the bed at the end of the corridor, with a clear view of the nurses' station, the eyes that had learned to read the world, in place of his ears, continued their quiet work. They recorded which face closed the staff room door half a second faster when she approached, which face mocked the heaviness of her walk behind her back, which face had stood laughing behind the observation glass that afternoon. One by one, missing none of them, storing each in his memory the way a man builds a list. And in the world Dario Barone came from, no list was ever made without a purpose. It happened on the morning of the 4th day after surgery, and it began with an accident so small that no one bothered to enter it in the shift log. An orderly was pushing a supply cart around the bend in the corridor just outside the room at the far end of the hall, when one wheel caught on a raised edge in the floor, and the metal tray on the top shelf slid off and struck the tile with a piercing crash that made everyone along the corridor turn their heads. Delaney was standing beside the bed, changing an intravenous fluid bag, and because her profession was built on observation, she saw what no one else saw. In both ears, flinched sharply in his left shoulder, at the exact instant the tray struck the floor, not before and not after. She froze with the fluid bag in her hands. According to everything written in his medical record, that response was impossible. A person with complete sensorineural hearing loss wouldn't react to sound, no matter how loud it was, without seeing its source, and his eyes had been turned toward the window at that moment, with his back to the corridor. But Delaney knew something else. Something she had learned during the years she spent caring for elderly patients back home. Sound didn't enter the human body only through the air. It also traveled through the floor, through the iron frame of a bed, through bone, and there were kinds of deafness that closed one path while leaving another open. If the damage lay in his auditory nerves, every door would already be locked. But if what had failed was only the mechanism that conducted sound through the middle ear, if the tiny bones inside had been knocked out of position by the blast, then vibration might still find its way in through bone, and the movement of his shoulder hadn't been something she imagined. It was an unlocked door no one had bothered to test. She decided to try quietly, in a way that wouldn't frighten him, and wouldn't make her the laughingstock of the department if she was wrong. At noon, when only the 2 of them remained in the room, she wrote on the board that she needed to test something, that he should close his eyes and raise one finger whenever he felt anything unusual, any sensation at all. He looked at her for a second with the expression of a man who had grown accustomed to doctors testing him in every possible way and being disappointed in every possible way. But he still closed his eyes, because it was her. Delaney stood at the foot of the bed, completely outside his field of vision, and tapped her knuckles against the iron rail of the bed frame 3 times slowly. The index finger of his uninjured hand rose. She held her breath, changed position, and tapped twice in quick succession against the rail on the opposite side. His finger rose again, this time accompanied by a deep crease between the brows of the man whose eyes remained closed, as though he didn't understand what had just touched him from inside his own body. She tapped a 3rd time, only once, very softly. His finger rose for the 3rd time. Delaney stepped back, her heart beating like a drum, and inside her mind, 2 pieces of paper placed themselves side by side. On one was the conclusion printed in the transfer record: profound bilateral sensorineural hearing loss, permanent, no intervention indicated. On the other were the 3 movements of a finger belonging to a man who couldn't see her hand. Both couldn't be true. A sensible nurse at St. Ambrose, after everything waiting for her in the staff lounge, would have left the opinion of a renowned audiologist untouched and reminded herself that she was only a nurse. Delaney opened the workstation computer, signed in with her code, found the nursing notes section of Baroni's medical record, and typed a single line in the dry, formal language she had been trained to use. Patient demonstrated 3 consistent responses to vibration transmitted through bed frame, while source remained outside visual field. Findings are inconsistent with diagnosis of complete sensorineural hearing loss. Audiology consultation and reassessment respectfully requested. She read the entry once, then clicked save. There was no fanfare and no witness, only one note written by a nurse the entire department looked down upon, buried among hundreds of other lines in a thick medical record. But from the moment it was saved into the system with her name and a timestamp beside it, it existed. It was official. It couldn't be erased. A fragment of truth had been fixed in writing and driven like a nail into the record, and no one, not even the woman who wrote it, could imagine how many large things those 15 words would one day bring down. At the end of her shift, she returned to his room carrying the board, hesitated for a moment, then wrote what she believed plainly, because she believed patients had the right to know anything concerning their own bodies. I'm not a doctor, but today you felt vibration 3 times without seeing its source. I think your diagnosis may be wrong. I've requested another evaluation. She turned the board toward him. Dario read it, and for the first time in 4 days, the face that had remained as calm as frozen water cracked open. It didn't break into joy, but into something closer to pain, because for 6 months this man had been doing the hardest thing he had ever done. He had taught himself to stop hoping. He had closed that coffin and tightened every screw with his own hands. And now a woman holding a whiteboard stood before him, tapping softly against the lid and telling him that something inside might still be alive. He took the marker and wrote slowly. The best doctor said it was permanent. Do you know what it costs to hope again and lose it again? Delaney read the words, and she didn't answer with the soft assurances people used to fill silence. She wiped the board clean and wrote one short sentence in rounded letters leaning slightly to the right. Hope isn't a feeling. It's a process. We do each step correctly. Step 1 is staying again. He stared at the words for a long time, longer than he had stared at the orientation card on the first day he woke, then nodded once, a brief, decisive nod, as though signing an invisible contract. Neither of them knew that in another corridor of the same hospital, a man in a gray suit had just asked for directions to the room at the far end of the hall, carrying a bouquet of white flowers in his arms, his face already arranged into an expression of perfect concern. The man in the gray suit entered the room at the far end of the corridor, with a bouquet of white flowers held against his chest and eyes that had already managed to redden before he stepped out of the elevator. Carlo Barone did everything exactly as a devoted cousin should. He placed the flowers on the windowsill, took Dario's uninjured hand between both of his, and slowly formed each word with exaggerated clarity so the man in the bed could read his lips. The entire family had been praying. The Quinns would pay. Dario only needed to focus on recovering because Carlo was taking care of everything at the harbor. Dario nodded and returned the pressure of his hand, and if his gaze briefly passed over the place Carlo had chosen to sit, the chair on the left side of the bed beside the ear with the more severe damage, his face revealed nothing. Suspecting the only relative he had left was a luxury a man, who had just buried his younger brother, wouldn't permit himself to consider. Carlo stayed for exactly 40 minutes, long enough to fulfill the role expected of him, and during those 40 minutes, the eyes of a man who survived by reading situations swept across the room and registered 2 things that made his tender smile stiffen at the corners. The first was the whiteboard propped beside the bed, where traces of sentences remained that hadn't been completely erased, evidence of a real conversation, something that, by every calculation he had made, shouldn't have existed. A Dario isolated inside silence was easy to control. A Dario who was communicating, who was officially documented as lucid and cooperative in the records of a public hospital, was a dangerous variable. The second thing was far worse. Before leaving the department, Carlo stopped at the nurse's station as a family member and asked for an update. The nurse on duty had no reason to conceal anything from a close relative, so she summarized the positive developments. The surgical wound was healing well, the patient was cooperative, and a nursing note had requested an audiology consultation and a new evaluation because the patient had responded to vibration. Carlo repeated the final part as though he hadn't heard it clearly. Another consultation. Another hearing evaluation. When the nurse nodded and confirmed the name attached to the note, Nurse Brooks, He smiled and thanked her with the expression of a man who had just received good news. Then he walked directly to the elevator, descended to the lobby, crossed the parking lot, and only when the door of the black car closed behind him did the mask of concern fall away. The first call he made was to Dr. Hargrove, and anyone who heard even half of that conversation would have understood immediately that the relationship between these two men wasn't that of a physician and a patient's relative. There wasn't an ounce of concern left in Carlo's voice, only the tone one used with an employee who had fallen behind schedule. "You assured me that diagnosis couldn't be overturned. Permanent means permanent, so explain to me why some insignificant nurse only had to tap on a bed frame before requesting another consultation. What happens if an independent audiology panel examines the original scans? You understand that better than I do." The person on the other end gave a long reply, and Carlo ended the call with one brief sentence: "Then don't let it happen." The second call was far more courteous because it went to the office of Gerald Pruitt, the chief executive officer of St. Ambrose Medical Center, and Carlo never needed to threaten Pruitt. He only needed to remind him. He reminded him that the anonymous charitable foundation that had funded the hospital's rehabilitation wing for the past 3 years was still considering its next grant. He reminded him that the Barone family had always valued discretion, that his relative was a target for dangerous people, and that every employee who entered that hospital room presented a security risk. For all those reasons, the family wished to make 3 modest requests. The list of personnel allowed into the room should be reduced to the bare minimum. Any consultation that wasn't urgently necessary should be postponed so the patient could rest, and the hospital should begin preparing the paperwork to transfer him to the family's private clinic as soon as the surgical wound permitted, where Dr. Hargrove, the physician who understood his medical history best, could continue his care. Pruitt sat in an office lined with framed awards, holding the phone between his shoulder and ear, and heard the 3 requests wrapped in silk. But he understood only one thing: the size of the donation. He responded in the smooth language of administration, saying the hospital always placed patient safety and family wishes above all else. By that afternoon, an email from hospital administration had reached the inboxes of the relevant department heads. The audiology consultation for the patient in the last room was to be temporarily postponed for reasons of security and treatment stability, and the list of personnel with access to him would be reviewed. The machinery of destruction by paperwork had begun to turn, silent and smooth, exactly in the style of the man operating it. But one pair of eyes had already seen more than that machinery wanted noticed. In the room across the corridor, where Mickey Doran lay with one leg in a cast and a private order to himself never to take his eyes off his employer's door, the older bodyguard had watched the entire 40-minute visit through the narrow opening of his own door. 3 things troubled him in the particular way 20 years of surviving that life had taught him to trust. Carlo left the room wearing a grieving expression, but at the nurse's station, after hearing the nurse's answer, his shoulders tightened for half a second before his smile could conceal it. Carlo moved toward the elevator faster than he had entered, and the white flowers he had brought, immaculate white lilies, were the kind placed around coffins at every funeral the family had ever held. It could have been an innocent mistake, Mickey told himself. A man couldn't accuse someone over a bouquet of flowers. Even so, he pulled out the small notebook he kept hidden beneath his mattress, the old-fashioned habit of a man who didn't trust telephones, and in handwriting as ugly as chicken scratches, he recorded the date, the time, and 3 words: white lilies. Then he underlined them twice. While Carlo's machinery of paperwork began turning from the outside, another machine was being wound from within, and the most frightening part was that the 2 people operating them had never met, had never heard each other's names, and had no idea the other existed. Diane Kessler didn't need to be bribed. She had a motive of her own, one far older and far more human. For the past 2 weeks, the entire emergency department had been looking at her differently. The younger nurses had stopped laughing when she mocked someone, and the case that should have crushed the Brooks girl was now being retold during shift changes as a model lesson, with that girl's name occupying the place that, for 15 years, had belonged only to Diane's. A person who had built an entire career on authority couldn't allow that authority to crack because of a whiteboard, so Diane did what people like her always did when reality turned against them. She rewrote reality in official language. The internal incident report was submitted to administration on Monday morning, composed in the flawless procedural language only 15 years of experience could produce, and in it, that afternoon, was retold as an entirely different story. Nurse Delaney Brooks had independently ordered the entire medical team to step away from a critically ill patient, an action beyond the scope of practice of a nurse, still within her probationary period. The delay caused by writing on a board, a method not included in the approved protocol, had prolonged the time before surgery and placed the patient at unnecessary risk. The patient's stabilization had resulted from the sedation protocol prepared by the team, under the supervision of the head nurse. Then came the most insidious part, written in the most concerned voice. Nurse Brooks's unusually frequent presence at the bedside of this male patient suggested a personal attachment beyond professional boundaries, something especially troubling in an unmarried pregnant employee who might be emotionally unstable, and for the sake of the hospital's reputation, the situation needed to be corrected promptly. Not one word mentioned the whiteboard. Not one word mentioned that the sedative had never been opened. The report landed on Gerald Pruitt's desk the very afternoon he was struggling to find a way to carry out the Barone family's 3 silk-wrapped requests without leaving his own fingerprints behind, and when he reached the name of the employee being accused, Pruitt almost sighed with relief, because fate had placed gift directly into his hands. Here was a legitimate reason for disciplinary action, signed by a head nurse with 15 years of seniority, aimed at the exact person who most needed to be removed from the list of staff, allowed into the patient's room, the person who had written that troublesome request for another audiology consultation. 2 jaws of a vice that knew nothing of each other closed together, as smoothly as though they had been machined in the same workshop. One side needed Delaney gone to preserve a throne. The other needed Delaney gone to preserve a conspiracy. The administrative machine between them only had to sign. The decision was issued the following day in a dry telephone call from Human Resources. Nurse Delaney Brooks was suspended without pay while the incident report was reviewed, effective immediately, and she was forbidden from entering the 4th-floor inpatient unit under any circumstances. Delaney listened to the entire call without interrupting once, standing in the locker room with the phone against her ear and her other hand resting lightly on her belly. Then she said, "Yes, I understand. Thank you for informing me," and ended the call. She didn't slam a locker. She didn't go looking for Diane to confront her. She didn't stand in the middle of the department and tell everyone the truth, because she understood how places like this worked. Any loud protest now would simply be added to her file as further evidence of those 4 words, emotionally unstable condition. She quietly completed the remaining handoff records for her shift, folded her spare uniform into her backpack, and before leaving the building, paused for one brief second at the bottom of the stairs leading to the 4th floor, looked upward, then turned away and walked out toward the parking lot. On the 4th floor, the patient in the room at the end of the corridor noticed her disappearance before the morning was over. At first, Dario waited, because she had days off like everyone else, but by afternoon, when an unfamiliar nurse came in to change his intravenous fluids without writing a single word on the board first, he reached for the pad of paper, wrote 1 line, and held it up. "Where is Delaney?" The unfamiliar nurse shook her head in confusion, said something he didn't bother trying to read from her lips, and left quickly. He wrote the same question for the next person who entered, then for the next one after that, his handwriting growing larger each time, changing to capital letters, the hard strokes pulling against the wound beneath the dressing until it ached, and he ignored it. "Where is Delaney?" By the time the 4th floor shift had ended, every member of the team had stood before that question at least once and avoided it in a different way. The person who finally answered him was the one he hadn't asked. Diane Kessler came personally to the 4th floor near the end of the day, stood at a safe distance at the foot of his bed, and shaped her words slowly and clearly, accompanied by exactly the right amount of regret in her smile. She said Miss Brooks had requested a transfer to another department. To be honest, she had confided to her coworkers that she no longer wanted to be involved with a patient like him. Too complicated, too dangerous. A pregnant young woman had to put her own safety first. Surely he could understand that. Dario watched her lips shape every word, and inside his mind, Each word fell onto the scales he had used to weigh human motives for 20 years, only to be rejected at once, because that version matched none of the evidence he possessed. It didn't match the woman who had stood perfectly still 4 paces away from a man, driven out of his mind by terror. It didn't match the orientation card prepared before he had even needed it. It didn't match the sentence, "Hope is a process." He didn't believe a single syllable. But he wrote nothing in reply. He only nodded once, very slowly, allowing the woman to leave with the illusion that the matter was closed, while he remained in the silent room with the drainage tube still buried in his chest like a chain. Understanding for the first time since taking power what it meant to watch something wrong happen directly before his eyes and be unable to rise, unable to make a telephone call, unable to hear anyone, and unable to make anyone care enough to listen. That night, beneath the bedside lamp, he tore a sheet from the notepad and wrote not her name, but 2 small lines in sharp strokes leaning to the left, a list of tasks arranged in the same way he had always run his empire, and the first line contained only 3 words. Call Bishop. Mickey read the note, quietly slipped his encrypted personal phone from his pocket, and made the call on his employer's behalf before the night shift turned over. Those 4 words, suspended without pay, sounded lighter than being fired, but to someone who survived by dividing every paycheck into 3 pieces, they were merely a death sentence paid in installments. During the first week, Delaney still woke at her old hour because her body knew no other habit. She ironed the uniform she didn't know when she would be allowed to wear again, hung it neatly in the closet, then sat at the folding table beside the window with a notebook and a pen, and did what her mother had always done whenever life backed her into a corner. She wrote every number down on paper, so fear would have to reveal its full shape instead of circling in the darkness. The numbers were more frightening once they took shape. The payment on the $63,000 debt was due on the 5th. The rent on the studio was due on the 1st. Her health insurance would remain active only as long as she was still employed, and if the report reached the conclusion it had been written to reach, she would lose that coverage in the middle of her pregnancy, at the moment she needed it most. The continuation insurance human sources had once mentioned as though it were a benefit cost half her monthly rent, the kind of benefit designed for people who would never need to use it. And in the middle of the page, circled twice, was the upcoming anatomy ultrasound she had scheduled the month before, the most important examination of the entire pregnancy, when they would measure every finger and count every chamber of her baby's heart, with a copayment the insurance wouldn't fully cover. On Thursday afternoon, rain began to fall, and Delaney sat inside her old car in a supermarket parking lot with a tin cookie box resting on her lap, the box her mother had once used to store buttons, and which now held every coin and crumpled bill she earned in tips at the diner. She counted each wrinkled $1 bill, each quarter, arranging them into small stacks on the passenger seat while rain tapped against the roof. She counted once, then counted again because she didn't want to believe the answer, but the final amount was still short. Not short by much, but short, in the same way everything in her life was short now. Each thing lacking only a little, nothing enough to bring her down by itself, but together enough to make breathing difficult. She sat motionless for a long time, watching the rain twist into crooked trails across the windshield, then placed one hand on her belly, where the tiny life inside had recently begun to stir with its first kicks, soft as the beating of a butterfly's wings, and she spoke aloud inside the cramped car. "Mommy's sorry. Mommy will find a way." She didn't cry. Since the day she buried her mother, she had promised herself that tears were something to be saved. She gathered the small stacks of money, returned them to the tin box, closed the lid, started the engine, and drove home. The only solution she could see for now was to knock on every door. She sent applications to 6 hospitals and medical centers within a 30-mile radius, places where a nurse with her skills should only have needed to wait for the telephone to ring. But medicine in this city was a small village, and it spoke through channels that left no written record. The phrase under disciplinary investigation clung to her name, like a smell that couldn't be washed away. 6 applications brought 6 silences, 1 telephone interview that ended abruptly after the question of why she was leaving her current position, and 1 automated rejection email delivered at 3:00 in the morning. The only place that still kept its door open to her was the late-night diner beneath the elevated tracks, where the owner asked only one question: Can you still stay on your feet for 8 hours? And so, on weekend nights, Delaney could once again be seen tying on an apron and carrying coffee to truck drivers, her feet swollen inside shoes held together with glue, her rapidly rounding belly no longer hidden beneath the apron. One quiet night, she was wiping the plastic table in the farthest corner, the one with its back against the wall, when her hand suddenly slowed halfway through. She straightened and stared at the empty chair across from her for a very long time, thinking nothing she could clearly name, only feeling something inside her sink for no reasonable cause. Then she shook her head, smiled at her own foolishness, and finished wiping the table. She didn't allow herself to think about the man from the stormy night anymore, just as she didn't allow herself to think about the patient behind the fourth-floor doors, because thinking about things beyond her reach was a kind of waste someone in her circumstances couldn't afford. But the past didn't need her permission. It found her on an evening early in the week in the form of a young woman standing nervously outside the studio apartment, with a cloth bag clutched against her chest. Becca Shaw was a second-year emergency department nurse, who, during the past 2 years, had never dared say more than 5 words at a time to Delaney, for fear Diane would decide they were on the same side. Becca didn't come inside. She remained at the threshold, pulled something from the cloth bag, and placed it into Delaney's hands with both of hers, as though surrendering something fragile. It was a worn paper notepad pulled from the table beside his bed, and Becca spoke quickly, stumbling over the words. She had found it that morning propped outside the door of the last room on the 4th floor. The man inside had kept signaling to everyone who passed, asking them to take it and find the short-haired brunette nurse who usually worked mornings. No one had dared carry it because they were afraid of becoming involved in the trouble, so Becca had finally taken it. She was sorry she hadn't been brave enough to do something sooner. Then Becca hurried down the stairs, almost running. Delaney stood alone beneath the weak yellow light in the hallway and opened the notepad. Across the top page was a sentence written in capital letters, the strokes broad and dark, trembling faintly at their ends as though they had been made by a hand straining against pain. "Where is the woman? Wow, saved me." She remained there for a long time in the drafty corridor of the building beside the train tracks, holding in her hands the most honest, direct, undeniable proof of the entire truth the report had tried to overwrite. It was the patient's own testimony, written in his own hand, and she understood the bitterest contradiction of her situation. She was literally holding the truth, yet there wasn't a single door, form, or procedure that allowed a suspended nurse to submit that handwritten plea to the investigation being conducted against her. A train thundered past overhead, the lights from its cars flashing across the capital letters. And beneath the yellow hallway lamp, the pregnant woman held the notepad against her chest a little more tightly, as though even if she couldn't use it to save herself, she could at least keep it from getting wet in the rain. 2 days later, on a rainless afternoon, someone knocked on the door of the studio apartment. 3 polite, evenly spaced knocks, and when Delaney opened it, she found a man who belonged in the building, beside the train tracks so little that the sight was almost absurd. He wore a tailored charcoal gray suit, carried a polished leather briefcase, smelled faintly of the discreet cologne favored in offices with thick carpeting, and wore a smile trained to be neither too warm nor too cold. He introduced himself as an attorney representing the interests of the Barone family, asked for 5 minutes of her time, and after a second of hesitation, Delaney opened the door wider, partly out of courtesy and partly because the name Barone now carried too many questions she had no one else to ask. The attorney sat in the only chair beside the folding table, rested the leather case on his lap, and swept his eyes around the room exactly once, no longer than necessary, yet missing nothing, the stack of bank envelopes on the table, the shoes repaired with glue drying beside the door, the black and white ultrasound photograph taped to the refrigerator with a small strip of adhesive tape. Delaney saw him see all of it, and she understood that the glance wasn't curiosity, it was an appraisal. People didn't bring an offer to someone until they had finished calculating the value of that person's desperation. He began in the voice of a man reading contractual terms, saying the family deeply appreciated her dedication to the patient, that the family was also aware she was going through an undeservedly difficult period at work, and that they wished to offer assistance. He opened the case, placed a thick, square craft paper envelope on the folding table, Heavy in the particular way only cash was heavy, and stated the amount with the same even tone he might have used to read out a case number. $50,000. Maternity assistance. Then he removed a thin packet of printed documents. All she needed to do was review and sign the statement, merely an internal formality, confirming that while caring for Mr. Barone, she had observed periods of confusion, disorientation, and impaired cognition caused by trauma and medication, and that some of her earlier medical record entries, particularly the note concerning his response to vibration, had been written with incomplete information and might have been mistaken. The room grew so quiet that she could hear the refrigerator running. Delaney looked at the envelope, and she would never tell anyone what her mind did during those seconds, because it did what a mind trapped against a wall was forced to do. It calculated $50,000 would shrink the $63,000 debt into something she could face without becoming dizzy. It meant attending the 20-week ultrasound without counting loose change from a cookie tin. It meant spending the first 3 months of her child's life without returning to the late-night diner immediately after giving birth. It meant a new crib instead of the used one she had already found in the second-hand listings. It meant sleeping for one night without dreaming of bank envelopes. And all of it could be hers in exchange for 15 minutes, one signature, and a few sentences that had already been written for her. She wouldn't even have to compose the lie herself. She only had to place her name beneath another version of the truth. Her hand rested on the table, 2 handspans from the envelope, and it didn't move through a silence so long that the attorney remained patiently still, because experience had taught him that silences like this usually ended with a signature. But during that silence, Delaney stopped looking at the envelope. She looked at the statement and reread one phrase. Confused, disoriented, cognitively impaired. Something in her profession, something in the deepest part of her, flared like a needle touching a nerve, because she had stood beside that man long enough to know those 3 phrases were 3 lies. More than that, she was intelligent enough to understand that no one paid $50,000 merely to correct a nursing note. These words had been prepared to accomplish something larger, something involving a man lying behind the 4th floor doors who couldn't hear anyone and whom no one was willing to hear. She looked up and asked one question, her voice as calm as though she were asking about the weather. What will this statement be used to do to him? The attorney blinked once, his trained smile remaining perfectly in place, and answered with a sentence that wasn't an answer. It was an internal family matter. She didn't need to concern herself with it. Her only responsibility was to confirm her own professional experience. Delaney nodded slowly as though she understood, and she did understand, in precisely the way he didn't want her to. She looked at the envelope one final time, for 1 second, long enough to say goodbye to everything it contained, the new crib, the dreamless sleep, the shrinking debt. Then she placed her hand on the envelope and pushed it across the table toward the attorney, slowly and decisively, and spoke in the voice of someone who had just crossed the longest silence of her life. I once wrote 3 words for him. You are safe. I wrote those words because I meant for them to be true, not because they were for sale. Take this back, and tell whoever hired you that my signature has no price. The attorney studied her for 2 more seconds. He didn't argue. He didn't persuade. He didn't threaten. He simply returned the envelope and the documents to his leather case with the precise movements of a man accustomed to both possible outcomes, stood, thanked her for her time, and closed the door behind him so gently that it made no sound. Left alone, Delaney sat in the chair that still held the stranger's warmth, and she remained there for a very long time, longer than she had sat counting money in the car beneath the rain. Her hands were clasped together on the empty tabletop where the envelope had rested, her eyes fixed on the ultrasound photograph attached to the refrigerator door, and no one witnessed that moment to describe what doing the right thing truly looked like. It didn't sparkle. There was no music behind it. It was only a woman sitting motionless in a room in the fading afternoon, listening to a train pass overhead and shake the window glass, seeing with perfect clarity everything she had just refused, and still breathing evenly, because among all the things she didn't have, one thing remained entirely hers, and tonight she would be able to sleep because of it. Meanwhile, on the 4th floor of St. Ambrose Medical Center, the words "call Bishop" had left the notepad and become a machine already in motion. It began with Mickey Doran's limping journeys, because with one leg in a cast and a family visitor badge clipped to his shirt, he had become the only line of communication Dario still trusted. Twice each day, Mickey crossed the corridor into the room at the far end, lowered himself into the chair beside the bed, and the two men spoke in their own way. Dario wrote sharp, concise instructions in left-leaning strokes across the board. Mickey read them, nodded, copied them into his notebook in his ugly chicken scratch handwriting, then tore apart whatever needed to be destroyed before leaving the room. 2 days later, a 60-year-old man, with silver hair combed straight back, and a leather briefcase far more worn than anything owned by his client, walked through the hospital's main entrance. Howard Bishop had served as chief counsel to the Barone family for 22 years. He had laid Dario's father to rest and had regarded the protection of the man's 2 sons as a debt of honor ever since. Now only one son remained for him to protect. Bishop didn't come carrying flowers. He came carrying paper. Seated beside the hospital bed, he read every line Dario wrote, occasionally answering with a question of his own beneath it. And when he left the room 90 minutes later, his old leather briefcase contained 3 documents bearing his client's signature. One was a comprehensive legal power of attorney. Another was a formal request for the complete medical records of Dario Baroni himself, something no hospital could lawfully deny a patient under federal law. The third was a document the St. Ambrose Legal Department would read 3 times that afternoon. A notice to preserve evidence requiring the hospital to retain intact every piece of data connected to the emergency admission that day, including treatment records, medication dispensing logs, entry records, and all security camera footage from the emergency department in anticipation of possible legal proceedings. There were no threats and no accusations. There was only paperwork, the one language that machine understood, and the machine had no choice but to obey, because deleting anything after receiving such a notice would be legal suicide. Packets of records began flowing into Bishop's office, and the old attorney read them the way he had read case files for 22 years, not searching for what was present, but for what was missing. The first thing he found was buried in the emergency department medication log, a neatly entered line documenting the sedative prepared under physician order for patient Barone, and returned to the medication station with its seal intact, unopened, accompanied by the signature of the medication nurse. It was a small line, but when Bishop placed it beside head nurse Kessler's incident report, which he had also obtained through the personnel records connected to his client's care, the report broke cleanly in half. A patient couldn't have been stabilized by a sedation protocol involving a syringe whose cap had never been removed. The second thing Bishop found was the nursing note entered on the 4th day after surgery. Patient demonstrated 3 consistent responses to vibration transmitted through bed frame while source remained outside visual field. Audiology consultation and reassessment requested. Signed Brooks. Immediately after it came the email from hospital administration, postponing that consultation for security reasons, and Bishop, who believed in coincidence no more than his client did, circled both in red ink before placing a call to the person he trusted most in the city's medical community. Dr. Naomi Feld was a 48-year-old otologist with 20 years of experience operating on the middle ear, a woman who had never accepted a single dollar from anyone named Barone and would never need to. Feld asked for only one thing: the original imaging and raw audiology data from Dr. Hargrove's records, all of which the patient's authorization entitled Bishop to obtain. 3 days later, she called him back in the voice of someone who had just seen her profession insulted. "Mr. Bishop, I reviewed the imaging 3 times and had a colleague examine it blindly without seeing the previous diagnosis. We reached the same conclusion. The acicular chain in the right ear was dislocated by the blast. That is a conductive injury, and it can be reconstructed surgically. The right auditory nerve is intact in every piece of data available. The left ear is more severely damaged, but even there, options still exist. A conclusion of permanent profilateral sensorineural hearing loss, with no intervention indicated, is incompatible with these images. To put it plainly, whoever wrote that conclusion either never looked at the scans or looked at them and deliberately wrote the opposite of what they showed." Bishop thanked her, ended the call, and sat motionless for a while in his office, crowded with files. Then he opened the final line of inquiry, the one he had postponed because he feared the answer. He ordered a review of the money moving around Hargrove's clinic, and beneath the third layer of shell companies, behind a vaguely worded medical consulting agreement, paid in 2 installments, the first 3 days before the hopeless diagnosis was signed, and the second 3 days afterward. The name behind the parent company appeared on the screen. Carlo Barone. Bishop printed everything into a report that wasn't thick, carried it to the hospital that evening, and sat silently in the chair beside the bed while his client read every page beneath the bedside lamp without overlooking a single line. Dario reached the final page, the one containing the money trail with his cousin's name at its end, and he didn't break anything. He didn't write an order. His face merely went still, in the way the sea goes still before a storm reaches shore. He lowered the report onto his lap, then did something that made the old attorney beside him turn his face away, because he felt he was witnessing something too private. Dario removed from the medical file the printed page containing Nurse Brooks's request for an audiology consultation, smoothed it flat, and placed it beside the diagram tracing his cousin's money. The 2 sheets lay side by side beneath the lamp. One belonged to the last blood relative he had left, the man who had placed a price on his silence and sold it. The other belonged to a stranger whom an entire system had tried to crush simply because she had written 15 words of truth into a medical record. The man stared at those 2 pages for a very long time in the soundless room before picking up the marker and writing a single line on the board for Bishop. It wasn't about Carlo. It was a question. Where is she, and what are they planning to do to her? The answer to the question written on the board arrived the following afternoon, and it caused every slowly turning gear to lock into place, as a single machine counting down. The St. Ambrose Administrative Office sent Nurse Delaney Brooks a letter directing her to attend the final disciplinary review meeting at 9 o'clock Friday morning, a meeting whose outcome had already been revealed by the language of the letter itself. The words conclusion and personnel action appeared in the first sentence, while the words employee statement were placed at the end, like a formality included only to make the record look complete. That same Friday morning, in the hospital's main lobby, a ceremony would be held to honor the emergency department staff for their handling of an exceptionally complex case. A phrase everyone understood referred to the man on the 4th floor. The speech the organizers had circulated to department heads for approval included a section in which Diane Kessler would speak on behalf of the team about cooperation under pressure, strict adherence to standard procedure, and decisive leadership at the scene. It was 4 pages long, and the name Delaney Brooks didn't appear once, not even in the acknowledgments. At the same time, another letter reached the chief of surgery, a request from the Barone patient's family, approved by the executive office with unusual speed, scheduling his transfer to the family's private medical facility for 3 o'clock Friday afternoon. The vehicle and transport team would be arranged by the family, and Mr. Carlo Barone would sign for the patient. 3 events, one morning, and not one person inside that administrative machinery realized they were scheduling a collision. On Thursday night, the city divided itself into glowing windows where no one slept. In a small apartment on the west side, Becca Shaw lay staring at the ceiling until well past midnight. Beside her was the phone she had picked up and put down more times than she could count. On its screen waited the draft of an email addressed to administration, offering her testimony as someone who had been present in the emergency department that afternoon. She had finished writing it 3 days earlier and hadn't once found the courage to press send, because sending it would mean placing her own name on the opposite side of a battle against Diane Kessler, a battle in which the emergency department's 15-year history had never recorded a survivor. But something was different tonight. Perhaps it was the image of the whiteboard she had carried all the way to Delaney's door before fleeing like a thief. Perhaps it was the capitalized sentence she had read across its surface. Near 1 o'clock in the morning, Becca abruptly sat up, opened her phone, read the draft exactly once, then pressed send before her courage could change its mind. Afterward, she turned off the phone and buried her face in the pillow, her heart pounding as though she had just run up 10 flights of stairs. Across the city, the lights in Howard Bishop's office remained on until 2 o'clock. The old attorney did 2 things that night. The first was to complete and electronically file an emergency petition to halt the transfer, arguing that the patient appeared to be the target of a sequence of medically fraudulent acts intended to strip him of his own legal capacity, and that transferring him to a facility controlled by the very parties under suspicion would expose him to irreparable danger. Attached was the independent assessment signed by Dr. Naomi Feld. The second task he performed more slowly and with greater care. He placed the records of the money trail, the shell companies, and the 2 payments surrounding the date of the false diagnosis into an unsealed envelope, then picked up the telephone and called a number he had kept for years for exactly this kind of moment. It belonged to a federal prosecutor whom Bishop knew had long been working a financial case involving money moving around the harbor. He spoke 1 sentence into the receiver, enough to secure a meeting at 7 o'clock that morning. "I have what you've been searching for over the past 2 years, and it doesn't lead to the man you think it does. On the 4th floor of St. Ambrose. The patient in the room at the end of the corridor didn't sleep that night either. Early Friday morning, he pressed the call button and wrote 2 requests on the board that made the nurse on duty read them twice. A razor and the suit his family visitor, Mr. Doran with the cast on his leg, would bring within the hour. The nurse wrote that he needed to remain in bed, that his drainage tube had only been removed 2 days earlier, and that the doctor had ordered limited movement. He read every one of her considerate words, nodded to acknowledge them, then wiped the board clean and wrote a single sentence in calm, left-leaning strokes that settled on the surface like a seal. "I have a meeting." In the studio apartment beside the train tracks, Delaney Brooks prepared for Friday morning in the way people prepare when dignity is the only thing they have left to protect. She ironed her uniform, even though she knew she might never wear it to work again, smoothing every crease in the sleeves as though she were preparing for the most important shift of her life. She folded it into a cloth bag along with her employee badge, which she intended to place on the table with her own hand if they asked for it, unwilling to make anyone take anything from her. She drafted a page of what she planned to say, not to plead, but simply to make sure the truth was stated fully and correctly. Then she crossed out half of it because it was too long. They wouldn't listen to all of it anyway. Finally, she stood before the refrigerator and studied the black and white ultrasound image for a while, resting a hand on her belly where the kicks that had once felt soft as butterfly wings had become a familiar rhythm each evening. "Tomorrow Mommy has a meeting," she whispered. "Be good and don't kick me at 9 o'clock. She went to bed early, unaware that 12 miles away, a man was testing the sleeve of a suit over a shoulder still wrapped in bandages. She didn't know about the email sent at 1 o'clock in the morning. She didn't know about the envelope waiting on the desk of a federal prosecutor. She didn't know that the morning she was preparing to enter like a trial had been prepared by 3 other people, each in a different way, like a battle. And outside, the city continued drifting toward Friday dawn, slowly and peacefully, like the surface of the water 1 second before the first wave reached the shore. The second-floor conference room at St. Ambrose was a windowless space with a long table and beige walls designed so no one would ever remember them. And at 9 o'clock on Friday morning, a neatly printed packet bearing the title Voluntary Employment Termination Agreement had already been placed at the center of that table, with a pen laid diagonally across it like a suggestion. Delaney sat alone on one side of the table. Across from her were the head of administration and a human resources representative, while Gerald Pruitt sat at the head with the posture of a man who wanted everything finished before 10 so he could make it downstairs for the ceremony. They presented the findings again in the flat voice, used for reading official minutes. Conduct beyond the scope of practice, procedural delay, an inappropriate relationship with a patient, and they explained that voluntary resignation was the hospital's final act of leniency, that it would leave her professional record cleaner than a termination, that she should think about her future and her circumstances, with the word circumstances emphasized just enough for everyone to understand exactly what it referred to. Through the closed door came the clatter of workers assembling the stage in the main lobby, followed by the sound of a microphone being tested. 1, 2, 1, 2, the ceremony honoring the department being completed downstairs like a cruel piece of background music no one in the room acknowledged. Delaney listened to all of it without interrupting anyone, both hands resting quietly at the edge of the table, and when the head of administration pushed the packet and pen a few inches closer, She looked down at the title, then raised her eyes and spoke in a voice no louder than ordinary conversation, yet clear enough that everyone in the room heard every word. I've read the findings carefully, and this is the last time I'll answer them. That day, I explained everything to the patient before anything was done. I obtained his consent before anyone touched him. He signed his surgical consent form with his own hand while fully conscious and aware. I won't sign my name to a document calling those things misconduct. Whatever action you choose to take is your decision. The room fell silent for a beat, the uncomfortable silence of people being forced to finish an ugly task with their bare hands instead of being handed gloves. Pruitt glanced at his watch and nodded toward the head of administration, signaling for the next step. When the conference room door opened, no one knocked. The first person through was a silver-haired man carrying an old leather briefcase. But hardly anyone looked at him for more than half a second, because behind him came a sight that made the human resources representative rise instinctively from her chair. A tall man in a dark suit entered, the left sleeve pulled over the rigid dressing around his shoulder, his freshly shaved face still pale from blood loss, but his eyes carrying not one trace of a patient's weakness. He walked slowly and upright into the center of the room, and completing the group was a young woman in a nurse's uniform who remained close to the door, both hands clasped tightly together. Becca Shaw's face was bloodless, but her feet didn't retreat. Delaney looked at the man in the suit, and for 1 second her world tilted slightly, because she had never seen him standing upright in his own clothes, had never seen this version of the patient from the room at the end of the corridor. But she had no time to arrange the feeling into thought, because everything that followed unfolded in a sequence someone had prepared with exact precision. The man approached the conference table and, with his uninjured arm, placed a large whiteboard on the surface beside the resignation packet. The words written across it had faded slightly, but they were still perfectly legible. You're in a hospital. You're safe. I won't touch you without warning you first. It was the original board from that afternoon, preserved instead of erased, and he set it down gently like evidence before a court, then stepped back and stood still. He wrote nothing. He made no gesture. He simply stood there with a silence the entire room suddenly recognized as the heaviest pressure ever to cross that threshold. The silver-haired man placed his briefcase on the table and introduced himself in the measured voice of someone who had spoken before judges 1,000 times. Howard Bishop, legal counsel and authorized representative for patient Dario Barone. Before you finalize any personnel decision connected to the events of that afternoon, my client requests that you allow 10 minutes for several documents. He opened the briefcase without haste, removed a tablet, set it on a stand where everyone around the table could see it, and continued. First, emergency department security footage supplied by the hospital under the evidence preservation notice. I'll begin at 2:14 in the afternoon. The screen lit up without sound, showing only images from a high corner angle. A chaotic trauma room, a large figure forcing himself upright in the center of a ring of staff, employees stepping back in response to an order. Then a small woman carrying a whiteboard entering the open space, stopping, lifting both empty hands, and standing still. Everyone in the conference room watched the scene unfold in complete silence. They watched the woman on the screen right on the board. They watched the man on the screen lower himself onto the edge of the stretcher. Bishop spoke evenly, like a narrator describing documentary footage. Please note that throughout this entire sequence, no injection was administered, and please note this position here. He touched one finger to a motionless figure standing behind the observation glass from the beginning of the recording to the end. This is head nurse Kessler's location throughout the period her incident report describes as direct on-site supervision. No one spoke, but the human resources representative had stopped taking notes, and Pruitt leaned slightly toward the screen with the expression of a man learning for the first time that the footage existed. Bishop allowed the silence to continue for exactly 3 seconds before removing another sheet of paper. Second, the medication dispensing record from that date, bearing a signature and documenting that the sedative was prepared under physician order and returned with its seal intact, unopened. He placed the page beside the whiteboard, aligning it carefully like a mason setting the second brick, then lifted his gaze to the faces around the table, each one growing more strained than the last, and said in the same calm voice, without raising it by even a single note. And there is one more record. The final record Bishop removed from his briefcase was a thin packet bearing the seal of an independent clinic, and he presented it more slowly than the two previous pieces of evidence, as though he wanted to make certain every word touched the table. This is the assessment of Dr. Naomi Feld, an otologist with 20 years of experience in middle ear surgery, conducted using the original scans and raw test data from my client's own medical records. Her conclusion, independently confirmed by a colleague through a blinded review, is that my client's injury is conductive in nature. The acicular chain in his right ear was dislocated by the blast and is indicated for reconstructive surgery. The auditory nerve on the right side remains intact in every set of data. In other words, the diagnosis of permanent, hopeless hearing loss with no intervention indicated, which my client has been forced to live with for the past 6 months, contradicts the very images beneath which that diagnosis was signed. Bishop laid the packet beside the first two pieces of evidence, then placed a single page on top, a diagram of arrows connecting rectangular boxes, and for the first time that morning, a layer of steel entered the old attorney's voice. We also reviewed the financial activity associated with the clinic of Dr. Hargrove, the man who signed that diagnosis, and discovered a consulting agreement paid in 2 installments. The first was made 3 days before the diagnosis was signed. The second was made 3 days afterward. The payments passed through 3 layers of shell companies, whose ultimate owner, he paused for half a second, is Mr. Carlo Barone, my client's cousin, who is standing in the lobby of this hospital at this very moment to supervise my client's transfer at 3 o'clock this afternoon to a facility he personally arranged. The name fell onto the conference table like a heavy object, and before anyone in the room had time to breathe, the man in the dark suit, who had stood motionless like a stone pillar from the beginning of the meeting, stepped forward. Dario took the marker from the groove of the whiteboard with his uninjured hand, removed the cap, and directly beneath the 3 faded lines of rounded, right-leaning handwriting from 4 weeks earlier, he wrote in sharp, dark capital letters, slowly and deliberately, "She made me stop." Then he raised the board so everyone at the table could read it, the handwriting of 2 people layered across the same surface, and while every gaze remained fixed on it, he did something no one in the room, not even Bishop, had been told to expect. He opened his mouth, and he spoke. The voice of a man who hadn't heard himself for 6 months was a sound that required absolute silence to follow. His vowels slipped away from their proper pitch. His volume rose and faded like a radio searching for a signal, and every word was forced outward through visible effort in his jaw and the muscles of his throat. But every word reached its destination, and the entire room sat motionless as that man paid the price of speaking without being able to hear his own voice. 6 months ago there was a bomb, he said. My brother died 3 steps away from me. The last thing I saw was his mouth trying to tell me something, and I'll never know what it was. He stopped to draw breath, the dressing over his shoulder rising and falling. That afternoon, when I woke in your emergency room, I wasn't here. I was still inside that other afternoon. People were pressing down on me from every direction, and I couldn't hear anything. To me, you weren't doctors. You were people who had come to finish what had been left undone. He turned his head and looked directly at Delaney for the first time since entering the room. She was the only person in this building who understood that I wasn't angry. I was afraid, and she gave me the only thing I could still understand inside that fear. The doctors closed my wound, he said, and his voice dropped completely on that sentence, distorting around the words, but no one in the room dared move. But she was the reason I allowed them to do it. Then, inside the thickening silence, he tucked the marker beneath his injured arm, slipped his good hand into the inner pocket of his suit, and removed his leather wallet. With movements so slow and careful they felt ceremonial, he drew out a paper napkin folded into quarters, and worn soft at all 4 corners, opened each crease, smoothed it flat, and placed it on the table beside the whiteboard. No one was told what to do, but every head around the table lowered on its own, and every pair of eyes made the same comparison. The full, rounded loops of the letters, the slight slant toward the right. On the worn napkin, the faded ink read, "Every storm eventually passes. You don't have to hear it to know that." And on the whiteboard was the same handwriting, exactly the same, impossible to mistake. Dario watched the room understand, then raised his uninjured arm, pointed directly at the woman sitting silently across the table, and spoke his final sentence in a voice distorted yet unmistakably clear in every sound. She saved me twice. The first time, neither of us knew the other's real name. Then the entire room witnessed something no official record could ever fully capture. The moment Delaney Brooks's face changed, the moment she looked at the napkin on the table, at the familiar left-leaning handwriting that had once left a sentence unfinished, at the man standing in the center of the conference room in a dark suit, and 4.5 months rearranged themselves inside her eyes into a single straight line, the late-night diner, the rain, the name Rio hesitating at its first stroke, the headlights of the black car at dawn, and her hand, without anyone telling it to move, without her even realizing, lifted from the table and came to rest lightly over her belly, as though shielding, as though confirming, and every gaze around that table quietly followed her hand and stopped there. No one spoke aloud the truth they had all understood at the same moment. The room simply fell silent, a silence that could almost be heard. Gerald Pruitt broke it, with the voice of a man walking across a floor that had just collapsed beneath him. He requested that the meeting be suspended, and during the hour that followed, everything that had to happen happened quickly. Every finding from the disciplinary investigation was formally withdrawn from Nurse Brooks's record, pending a complete new review. Downstairs in the main lobby, where the recognition ceremony was about to begin, and flower arrangements lined the stage, 2 men in dark blue suits with federal badges displayed on their chests moved through the crowd of invited guests, stopped in front of the man adjusting his tie before taking his seat in the front row, and asked Mr. Carlo Barone to accompany them. The handcuffs closed around his wrists between 2 arrangements of white flowers and a forest of raised telephones. He didn't shout. He only went pale and repeated the words "my lawyer" until he disappeared beyond the glass doors. On the second floor, an emergency suspension notice for head nurse Diane Kessler was signed before the close of business, and the 4-page speech that didn't contain Delaney Brooks's name was never read. That night, after the hospital had settled into the kind of quiet broken only by the distant roll of a medication cart somewhere in the corridor, Delaney stood outside the door of the last room, on the 4th floor, with the small whiteboard held against her chest. The same board Becca had carried all the way to her apartment, and she remained there longer than necessary, not because of the restriction against entering, which had been lifted that afternoon, but because she knew that once she crossed this threshold, there would be no way back to the other side of the truth. Then she tapped twice softly against the doorframe, a meaningless habit for someone who couldn't hear, though she kept it because courtesy didn't require an audience, and stepped inside. Dario was sitting upright against the pillows, dressed again in hospital clothes, while the dark suit hung from a hook beside the cabinet like a suit of armor just removed. The bedside lamp cast a warm golden circle across the blanket, and on the table beside him, someone had already returned the large whiteboard from the conference room, the handwriting of 2 people still layered across its surface. He saw her and showed no surprise. He only shifted slightly, a wordless invitation, and Delaney pulled the chair closer to the bed, sat down, rested her small board on her lap, and for a long while, the 2 of them simply remained that way in a room without sound, the 2 whiteboards between them like blank pages waiting to be filled. Then Delaney uncapped her marker and wrote each word slowly. "There's something I need to tell you." She turned the board toward him. Dario read it and gave a faint nod, but instead of taking the marker and writing on his own board, he did something else. He reached for the wallet on the table and removed the second paper napkin everyone in the conference room had seen that afternoon. No, she realized at once when he unfolded it. This was the other napkin, his napkin, the one she had found beneath the cold coffee cup at dawn, with the unfinished sentence in left-leaning handwriting. If I were someone else. Somehow he had taken it back without her knowing, or perhaps, she suddenly understood, this one had always remained with him, while the one she had kept for 4.5 months was the napkin she had written for him. 2 napkins from one night had traveled separate paths across an entire city only to arrive together in this room. He smoothed the napkin flat on the table, picked up the pen, and after the sentence that had remained unfinished for 4.5 months, he wrote the rest, his handwriting still leaning to the left but slower than before. Then I would gone back to that diner every night. He pushed the napkin toward her. Delaney read the sentence that had finally been completed after 4.5 months, and she sat motionless for a very long time. Then, instead of writing anything on the board, she opened the cloth bag she had brought with her, removed a paper envelope whose edges had grown soft from being picked up and put down too many times, and placed it on the blanket between them. He looked at her for a second, waiting for permission. She nodded. With his uninjured hand, he opened the envelope and removed the black and white ultrasound photographs, and tucked among them, carefully folded into quarters, was his napkin, the one she had kept. Her storm lay beside the images of a tiny life beginning to take shape, and in the corner of every photograph, printed in small mechanical lettering, were the date and the number of weeks. A man who had spent his entire life making calculations needed no explanation. The dates arranged themselves into a line, and the line pointed back to a rainy night. The room was so quiet that Delaney could hear her own breathing change as she watched his face while he studied the photographs. He looked at them for a long time. Then his uninjured hand searched for the marker, like a man feeling for something in darkness. He pulled the large whiteboard closer and wrote only 2 words in the empty space beneath the older lines, the final stroke trembling. "My child?" The 2 words stood alone on the board. Delaney looked at them, then at the hand gripping the edge of the board as though it were the side of a boat, and she nodded, slowly, clearly, leaving no room for misunderstanding. The most ruthless man in Chicago closed his eyes for 3 seconds. When he opened them, Delaney wrote on her smaller board, not the words people usually spoke in moments like this, but her own truth, as direct as every sentence she had ever written for him. "I don't need you to do anything, and I have to tell you this. I'm afraid of your world. I don't want my child growing up learning to read lips so she'll know when she has to hide." He read it, and he didn't answer immediately. He didn't instinctively deny it or pour out promises. He studied the words long enough for her to know he had weighed them on a real scale. Then he wiped a corner of the large board and wrote slowly, setting down each word like a stone. "You're right to be afraid. Give me time to prove myself through actions, not words. And one more thing. Our daughter belongs to none of the family's business, not now, not ever. That isn't a promise, it's a boundary. Anyone who crosses it will have to face me first." Delaney read it twice and felt a knot inside her chest loosen by half a turn. It wasn't everything, but half a turn was still a great deal for one night. They remained together in the silence that had become a third language between them, and after a while, Dario set down the marker, looked at her, then lowered his gaze to where her hand rested lightly over her belly. Instead of reaching out as anyone else might have done, he pulled the board closer one final time that night and wrote a question. "May I touch her?" Delaney looked at those words, and a tear fell onto the small board in her lap, the first tear of a day that had felt as long as a lifetime, because within that question she saw the entire philosophy her mother had left her, the principle she had carried into every hospital room, the one people had mocked, the one that had nearly cost her career, now returning to her in the handwriting of a man the entire city feared. Ask permission before touching. She took his uninjured hand between both of hers and placed it over the place where the kicks, once soft as butterfly wings, kept her company each evening, and at that exact moment, as though she had been waiting for it from the beginning of the story, the tiny life inside her kicked directly into the center of her father's palm. In the weeks that followed, hope was carried out exactly as Delaney had defined it, not as a feeling, but as a process, one step at a time, with records, appointments, and even failures entered into the log. Dr. Naomi Feld took over the case with the honesty of someone who practiced medicine through evidence. At his first appointment, she wrote on the board, "I don't promise to return the world you once had. I only promise to do what these images allow." And the images allowed 2 things. In the right ear, where the auditory nerve remained intact, surgeons would reconstruct the ossicular chain, returning the smallest bones in the human body to the positions from which the explosion had knocked them. The left ear, where the damage had reached deep into the cochlea, would require an implant, an electronic device to perform the work that part of his body could no longer do. The surgery on his right ear took place on a Tuesday morning and was technically successful, but there was no miraculous moment like the ones in movies, no scene in which the bandages came off and birdsong suddenly filled the room. There were only weeks of healing, followed by testing sessions, while the first returning sounds arrived disordered and distorted, like an orchestra tuning its instruments. Running water sounded like paper being crushed. Footsteps sounded like blows against an empty barrel. And a brain that had lived in silence for 6 months now had to learn from the beginning how to name every sound, like a man returning to his childhood town and having to relearn the name of every street. The cochlear implant on the left side demanded even more patience, with long programming sessions and repeated listening exercises built around single-syllable words. One stormy afternoon, after mistaking the same word for the 11th time, the man who had once governed an entire empire with absolute composure tore off the practice headphones and threw them against the wall, then sat gasping in the therapy room with both hands gripping his head. The therapist quietly stepped outside. Delaney was the one who entered, her pregnancy having progressed significantly, now fully rounded beneath her clothes. She didn't pick up the headphones immediately. She didn't offer soothing words. She simply pulled a chair across from him, took out the familiar marker, and wrote on the small board she carried the same 5-word message she had once written for him on the morning of another life. Hope itself is a process. Then she added beneath it, today is one step in the process. A bad step, but still a step. Tomorrow we take the next one. He studied the words for a long time, then rose on his own, walked to the wall, retrieved the headphones, and returned to the chair. Life beyond the therapy room followed the same slow and honest processes. Carlo remained in federal custody awaiting trial, while the list of charges against him grew longer each week. Dario, between listening exercises, began doing something even harder than relearning sound. He sat with Bishop for hours every week and signed documents that gradually separated the family's businesses from the shadows, selling anything that couldn't be made legitimate. It was expensive, slow, and offered no guarantee of success, but he pursued it with the stubbornness of a man who had come to understand that the boundary he had drawn around his daughter meant nothing unless he crossed completely to the safer side of it himself. Then came the day of official activation. After the right ear had healed enough, and the cochlear implant on the left had completed its final round of programming. 4 people gathered that morning inside the audiology room. Dr. Feld sat behind the controls. The therapist stood nearby. Delaney waited in the corner, and in the center sat the man with the small device resting behind his ear. Feld wrote on the board the question she asked every patient at this moment, a small ritual of her profession. When I turn the device on, what do you want the first sound you hear to be? Everyone in the room, including Delaney, believed they already knew the answer. Her voice. That was what patients always chose, the voice of the person they loved. Dario took the marker, thought for a long time, then wrote one line and turned the board around. Something I've never heard before. The room remained still for several seconds before the meaning reached them, and Delaney understood first. Without needing an explanation, she rose, walked to the examination table against the wall, lay down, and lifted the hem of her shirt to expose her belly. The therapist, whose hands suddenly became unusually clumsy, rolled the fetal Doppler closer, applied the gel, placed the probe against Delaney's skin, and searched. Feld looked at Dario and raised 3 fingers, then 2, then 1, and activated the device. The first sound to enter Dario Barone's world after nearly a year of silence wasn't a human voice or music. It was a fast, steady, urgent rhythm, like the hooves of a young horse racing across a rain-soaked field, distorted through the electronic processor and strange as a signal arriving from another planet, but real. 140 beats each minute, his daughter's heart. No one in the room moved. The machine continued tapping its rhythm into the silence, and the 4 people gathered around that sound as though they were standing around a small fire newly kindled in winter. Then the shoulders of the man in the center of the room began to shake. The hands that had once signed sentences and controlled empires rose to cover his face, and Dario Barone, the man all Chicago believed nothing could reach, wept aloud in front of 3 medical professionals, the sobs awkward and distorted from a throat still unaccustomed to hearing itself. No one in that room, including the man who cried, mistook it for weakness, because they were all witnessing the same thing. A human being had just heard the reason to begin again, through ears that a woman carrying a whiteboard had refused to believe were dead. A few months later, the emergency department at St. Ambrose Medical Center was still fast, still loud, and still unforgiving of hesitation. But one thing had changed. Mounted neatly on the wall of every receiving bay was a new whiteboard with a set of markers, and the hospital procedure manual now contained an additional chapter that the younger nurses simply called the whiteboard protocol. Write before speaking, give warning before touching, ask permission before every step. It had been drafted by a working committee whose youngest member, the only one without any title beyond the word nurse, had been invited to chair the discussions, because everyone else understood where that protocol had truly begun. Delaney returned to work with a spotless professional record, and only one condition, one she stated herself at the first meeting. She wouldn't help write another chapter of paperwork only to have it buried in a drawer. If they were going to do this, the protocol had to change what actually happened inside the emergency room. There had to be real boards hanging on real walls, real training sessions, and real people assigned to carry it out. Funding for the entire program came from an anonymous foundation that everyone in the hospital could identify, but no one asked about, and it turned every part of her condition into reality. Then, on an early winter morning, the protocol's first true test was wheeled through the emergency department doors. He was a former construction worker who had lost his hearing in a pipeline explosion 3 years earlier, and had come in with a deep laceration on his forearm. 3 years of silence and medical visits filled with misunderstanding had taught the man to stiffen the moment he smelled antiseptic. His eyes darted constantly in search of an exit, and his uninjured hand gripped the side of the wheelchair, as though preparing for a battle experience had taught him would certainly come. But the battle never came. What came instead was a short-haired brunette nurse who pulled over a stool, sat low enough to meet his eyes, placed a whiteboard on the examination table, and wrote in rounded letters that leaned slightly to the right. "My name is Delaney. I won't do anything until you understand and give me permission." Then she turned the board toward him and waited, both hands resting open on her lap. She didn't look at the clock. She didn't glance behind her. She only looked at him. The man read the sentence once, then twice, and raised his eyes to study her face for a long time, the way people examine something to determine whether it is real. Slowly, the fingers gripping the chair began to loosen, and he nodded. Beyond the observation glass, in the exact place where people had once stood laughing over a betting pool, 3 new nurses now watched every gesture in silence. The person standing between them with a clipboard in her hand was Becca Shaw, now responsible for training new employees in the whiteboard protocol. From time to time, she pointed into the room and quietly explained something that made all 3 heads nod and all 3 pens move, learning a lesson no previous textbook had ever thought to teach. The original whiteboard from that afternoon, the board carrying 2 sets of handwriting layered over each other, wasn't displayed in the lobby beneath spotlights, though someone had once suggested it. At the request of both people who had written on it, it rested quietly on top of the highest shelf in the emergency department supply room, without a label or a glass frame, and not one nurse at St. Ambrose, not even the newest, ever had to ask what it was, because some objects don't need to be exhibited to change the way an entire group of people treats another human being. And in another part of the city, inside a small kitchen filled with afternoon sunlight, where the smell of simmering soup mingled with the distant sound of the train, and had become the familiar background music of daily life, a small whiteboard hung on the refrigerator door. The upper half held the schedule for her final upcoming prenatal appointment, in rounded, right-leaning handwriting. The lower half carried a list of baby girl names that 2 people took turns adding and crossing out in an election that had yet to reach a conclusion. In one corner, surrounded by a border so no one could erase it by mistake, were 4 words written in slow, steady strokes leaning to the left. The storm has passed. Some people never prove their strength by raising their voices. They change an entire room, and sometimes an entire life, simply by sitting down at the eye level of someone who is afraid, writing one kind sentence, and truly seeing the human being before them. Respecting another person has never been weakness. It is the most enduring kind of strength, the only kind capable of passing through silence, prejudice, and systems that seem impossible to move, reaching the place where all the noise in the world remains powerless. The story of Delaney and Dario ends here, but its lesson remains open. Kindness practiced with purpose isn't an ornament for dreamers. It is a real ability that saves real lives. Never underestimate someone because of their circumstances. And sometimes, what a person needs most isn't medicine or money, but simply someone willing to stop, ask permission, and listen with their whole heart. If today's story touched something inside you, please like the video and share it with someone who may need to hear that their kindness isn't meaningless. Subscribe to our channel so you don't miss the moving and meaningful stories we bring to you every day. More than anything, we sincerely want to know how this story made you feel. Have you ever met someone like Delaney in real life, or have you ever been looked down upon because of your circumstances? Please leave your thoughts from the deepest part of your heart in the comments, because every line you share is like a small whiteboard that may help someone out there feel seen. Thank you for staying with this story until its final words. We wish you and your family good health, happiness, and peace every day. Goodbye, and we'll see you again in the next video.